will introduce the first speaker, and then my co-chair, Jessica Manning, will introduce our second two speakers. So, Steve, you are the lucky one to speak first. So Steve Meshnick is an expert in vector-borne diseases research with over 300 publications, numerous former trainees. He received his MD from Cornell, his PhD in biochemistry from Rockefeller. His career spans multiple institutions, including the University of Michigan and now UNC, where he has served as the Director of Graduate Education in the Department of Epi. His projects involve sites throughout Africa and Southeast Asia. He's a professor in the Department of Epidemiology, served on the editorial board of HATMH for 3 decades, and is a fellow of the ASTMH. On a personal note, the opportunity to work with Steve and his team drew me to Chapel Hill from Boston back in 2014. It's rare to find an investigator with chops in the lab and in the field, but even rarer to find one with such a generous approach to the career development of his trainees. So I could stand here and recount endless stories of Steve's investment in me and in others in our group, but I'll let him do the talking. So take it from there, Steve.
All right, well, this is an odd topic, and I'm never quite sure what to say. Okay, can you hear me?
I think we need the mic.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's a very odd topic, but I think it's very useful because, in fact, everyone tries to hide their failures, and particularly when you write a paper, you write about everything you found, not about the things you didn't find. And so, and it's also a little bit about personal development, because I think failures are good not only in the lab but personally. I think you kind of have to fail to, none of us are perfect, and I think that if you fail and recognize your failures, you can move on personally. So, I'm going to give you a story about me. So I did an MD PhD, and I had dreams. My PhD thesis was I found this compound called hematoporphyrin D that cured mice and rabbits of sleeping sickness, and I had the whole mechanism worked out. And then I went and did a postdoc in Africa for a year in Kenya, and I still had this fantasy that I'd sort of found the cure, and I was going to go to Africa and eradicate this disease. So I brought some hematoporphyrin with me, and sleeping sickness is also a big cattle disease. So there's a KETRI, which is the Kenya Trypanosomiasis Research Institute, and they had cows with sleeping sickness. So one of the vets arranged for me I got there, gave him the drug, and he administered it. Had to do it IV to 2 cows with sleeping sickness, and they both went into convulsions and died within 5 minutes. I swear, before my very eyes, both cows were convulsing and then dead. And it was really a bad start. I still was fixated on this topic. And then I went to a meeting and found out that there was a strain of cows in Minnesota that were porphyric. They naturally had higher doses of porphyrin. So I thought this would be perfect for Africa. They would be porphyric. They'd be resistant to sleeping sickness. So the USDA wouldn't let me take trypanosomes to the Midwest because they were afraid that it would hurt our cattle, even though there are no tsetse flies in the Midwest. So we transported them to Rockefeller, and we had a mouse animal room, and the cows didn't fit in the elevator, so we had to walk them up the steps. And then I was actually doing my clinical rotation, but I had to bleed them every day or every couple of days. And I learned how to bleed cows. And when you bleed, the cows have a big tail vein. So you put a needle in the tail vein, and then you have to jump because they poop as soon as you do that too. So I got very good at bleeding cows. And in the end, there was no difference. They got sleeping sickness just the same. So I feel like I failed in a very glorious way. But it was a learning experience for me. I think that a lot of us have very high expectations of ourselves, and often they're very unrealistic. So fast forward to my first faculty position, I had I'm not going to mention names of institutions, and I wasn't particularly happy at this institution I was at, and there was a job opening at a neighboring Ivy League institution, and I was very keen on. It was in the pharmacology department. I was very keen on the job. And meanwhile, there was another researcher there who, in a different department, who had sort of wanted to collaborate with me, and he sent me some samples. And I thought this guy was kind of a nothing. I didn't think he was very smart, and I thought his ideas were dumb, and I just forgot about the samples and never did them. And so I went ahead and gave my job talk, and then they told me, we're not hiring you because we've heard bad things about you from this other guy. That was also a learning experience for me. It's like, what goes around comes around. I mean, it was really painful to get rejected from this, the job that I wanted. But to me, it was a learning experience. You need to, if you don't treat people with respect, it's going to, come back and bite you. So let me see. I had a list here. I have many failures, so I could go on for a long time, but I won't. Then I wound up taking a job at an institution without really any research infrastructure at all, and I spent several years of my life at an institution that it was not a good career choice. And a funny story there was they had such poor research infrastructure that when they asked for letters of recommendation, this was back before computers, they sent someone I knew a letter soliciting a letter of recommendation, which was, "Dear Doctor," and then fill in the blank. Can you write a letter of recommendation for Doctor, fill in the blank? And my colleague, who was a little bit too much into his sense of humor, sent back a letter saying, "I'm writing to recommend Dr. fill in the blank Meshnick for this job at," anyway. I eventually got the job, and I stayed there for a while. And then I think what I sort of realized, sorry about that. And so then this is the one sort of lab failure that I had that I'm going to talk about. And I was really interested in artemisinin because I was interested in free radicals. And I got some radioactive artemisinin, and I showed that it reacted with pure heme. So I thought, I just wanted to see what if it reacts with heme when they're in proteins. And so I mixed it with hemoglobin, and lo and behold, most of the artemisinin reacted with the protein part of the hemoglobin rather than the heme. And so, that was a clue to the mechanism of action, which later, I think a number of other groups have now demonstrated that's probably what happens with artemisinin, that artemisinin actually gets activated by iron, but then alkylates other proteins. So, so sometimes, a lot of lab mistakes could be very useful as well. I think what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time are grants, because everybody here, most people here probably write grants all the time, and if you're like me, you fail most of the time. And so I think there's a lot to learn, overall from grants, and I think the grant failures are actually important and often very positive changes in your life. So one example for me was this artemisinin story. I wrote a bunch of grants for that, and I could never get them funded. And then I wrote an epidemiology grant, a field grant, and it got funded on the first try. And I later figured out, I actually am more talented as an epidemiologist. I was never good in the lab. I never had the patience to stay late at night. I just hated keeping lab notebooks, and I wasn't really a great mentor for my PhD students because I didn't particularly have those skills either. But I really do like epi. I had sort of a talent for it, and I think if I hadn't failed at the NIH, I don't think I would have figured that out. So, again, it's pretty brutal when you get the failure, but in the long term, I think it helped me find something I was better at. So when you get a grant rejection, what do? Because it's a failure, right, essentially. And so, one thing obviously is that I've learned is persistence. You can't. I've had a lot of grants that didn't get funded. Like right now, we have I think 5 NIH grants for our Congo work, and but the first grant we had to submit we had 7 rejections before we got our first acceptance. So we wrote the grant over and over again, and there were A1s, and then we revised it and submitted it again. We submitted it to the NIH, we submitted it to the NSF, and sometimes the reviews were not helpful, but sometimes they were incredibly helpful. And one example would be that I wrote the grant originally as a straight epi grant, and then it was clear that it was just kind of observational. And then one of the criticisms was, well, how is this going to help the Congo? Or how is this going to help anyone? And then so we started a collaboration with the mathematical modelers at Imperial College, who then were able to come up with models to show how our findings would impact different interventions. And so, it sort of forced me into a collaboration, because those are skill sets that I didn't have, and it forced me into a collaboration with people who had complementary skills, and it's been a great collaboration. We've now been collaborating for 8 or 9 years and published lots of papers together, and it's just been, so again, I was kind of forced by a rejection to make a direction change, which was incredibly helpful. And the other thing I learned from grant rejections is communication. Like a lot of times people reject your grant because you haven't done a good job communicating it, and we have to be good communicators. And so I think that it's improved I've learned how to think about what to communicate and how best to. And when you get a grant rejection, I pretty much most of the time in a grant rejection, what they tell you is not what they mean. Like they'll say they don't like this experiment, but really they're saying they don't understand the approach, or they don't appreciate the approach. And so it's really learning how to sort of read in between the lines when you get a grant rejection and getting a feeling of that. Am I doing on time? Am I? Okay. 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 So I think I'm going to stop. And again. And then there are other times I've written. I've tried one particular topic, and I've written grants 11 times on it and never got them funded. So I finally stopped. So persistence is good to a point, but not to a certain point. I don't know. I think that's pretty much all I needed to say about failure. So any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Let me say that we're going to do a panel discussion at the end to take questions, but we have time for a question or two for Steve, if you've got one. All right. Well, if you think of questions, save them to the end. And I'm going to thank you, Steve.
Okay.
I'm going to introduce our next speaker.